So here we are again. We are looking at overlockers today. This tutorial follows on from another one I did on how to thread your overlocker, and this time we are going to be looking at different seams and different hem finishes that you can achieve on your overlocker. So by the end of this tutorial you'll have lots of ideas of different ways in which to use your machine. So the first thing we're going to do is just have a quick look at your machine and how it's set up. There's a couple of places that we're going to check that our threads are just where they should be, and that'll improve the results when you run your fabric through the machine. And we're also just going to have a closer look at the stitches that are being formed and see if there's a little bit of troubleshooting we can do there in case it doesn't quite look perfect. So before we get into stitching, what we're going to do is make sure that all our tension wheels are set to a 3. That's a good starting point, a 3 or a 4. And we're also going to double check that each of our threads are right down in between those tension discs. There are 2 little discs either side, and when the presser foot is down, they clamp together. Now, if your thread isn't firmly in between those discs, and with these vertical ones, it's very easy for the thread to simply sit on top as opposed to sitting in between them, you won't have any tension on your thread and your stitches will look a little strange. So just double check that all the threads are in between the tension discs. What you can do is, once your machine is all threaded, with the presser foot down, just pull the threads at the back to make sure they're all slotted in between these little tension discs up here. So that's our first check to do. The next little check to do before you put any fabric through your machine is to just wind the hand wheel anti-clockwise, so your thumb is coming over towards you, and run a few stitches so you can see that they are forming correctly. If you've threaded the overlocker in the right way, so the upper looper, then the lower looper, then the right needle, then the left needle, you should see that your stitches are forming quite nicely around the edge of the little stitch finger that's just down in here in the machine. So little loops of thread are forming round the stitch finger, and your little chain is coming out on the left hand side here. So for 4-thread overlocking, I'm going to have all of my tension dials started off at a 3, and we'll have a little run through the machine and see how those look. Our stitch length is set to 2.5. To pop your fabric under the machine, you can raise the presser foot and just pop the first edge of the fabric underneath. You don't want to try and push it past the little blade there. The little blade wants to cut as it moves the fabric in. So you just pop a little amount of fabric underneath the presser foot and then start with the treadle and run through, forming stitches with the machine. Chain off and cut your threads. Here we've got the upper looper, which is in pink, being held by the left, which is in blue, and the right, which is in green, needles. So the pink upper looper is coming over on the top of the fabric, and the left blue needle and the right green needle are holding it securely. Over on the other side of the fabric, we have the yellow lower looper, being firmly held by both the blue and green needle threads. At the very edge of the fabric, the pink upper looper and the yellow lower looper are linking, being held firmly in place one against the other right at the very edge of the fabric. If you see that one is pulling further over to the front or round to the back of the fabric, you may need to just play with the tensions a little bit, slightly increase one or slightly decrease the other to make sure that those loops are forming and linking at the very edge of the fabric. So that's what your normal 4-thread overlock stitch should look like. The 4-thread overlock stitch is a great strong construction stitch. You can use it either with just woven or stretch fabrics, and it will be a really strong seam with a nice neat wrapped up edge. From the right side of the fabric, you can just see, if I pull the fabric just a little, the blue thread that is the left hand needle. That's a good thing to know, because if you're wanting to match the colour of your project to the colour of your thread, it's only really the left hand needle that needs to be matched. The others, which will only be seen inside, but can be any colours you like. So for 3-thread overlocking, what you want to do is remove the left hand needle. Now I've taken the thread out of the left hand needle already. If you have quite a short chain, it's normally quite easy to tease that thread out from the rest of the chain. And then I'm just using, on this machine it's a little Allen key, but it may be a little screwdriver on your machine, just loosening off the little screw that's above the left hand needle. I'm holding the left hand needle as I do it, and I'm just going to gently take that needle away, leaving the right hand needle in place and threaded, and the lower looper and upper looper are all still threaded as well. We're now ready to do some 3-thread overlocking. Looking at the tension dials for my 3-thread overlocking, I've got the lower looper, the upper looper, and the right hand needle all set to a 3. The left hand needle is still set to a 3, but there is no left hand needle in the machine at the moment, so this dial isn't actually being used with any thread through it. Again, our stitch length is set to 2.5. So here's our overlocked seam with 3 threads. It's just got the green right hand needle running along, and that's what's holding the 2 layers of fabric together. We've got our pink upper looper wrapping the front top side of the fabric, and we've got our yellow lower looper wrapping the underside of the fabric. Again, they're linking right at the very edge of the fabric. And if I open that seam, you can see that you have the green thread that's holding everything together, with just that one single needle instead of the 2 rows we had with the 4-thread overlocking. So a 3-thread overlocking seam is slightly finer than the 4-thread and will also be ever so slightly weaker. So where it's an area of not that much stress and you want a lighter finish, the 3-thread overlocked seam is a really good option. For a flat lock seam, we still don't have the left hand needle in the machine, so we can just leave that at the tension it was when we took the needle out, because there's no thread running through here at all. Our right hand needle, we're going to put it right down to a 0. Our upper looper can stay the same at a 3. Our lower looper has gone right up to an 8. The stitch length is 2.5. A flat lock seam is sewn with the right sides of the fabric facing outwards and the wrong sides of the fabric being brought together. So it's the opposite way round. You would sew a normal seam where you would bring right sides together. So this is the right side of the fabric, and the stitches have been formed on the right side of the fabric. And the low tension on our needle thread means we can pull the 2 layers of fabric apart and flatten them so our seam appears on the outside of our fabric. And on the inside, we have a ladder stitch holding everything together, nice and flat. This is a great seam to use on sportswear and stretchy fabrics, anything like leggings or running vests, anything where you want to have that really strong seam and a nice flat finish to the seam as well. So that's a really good one to know. We're now going to set up for a rolled hem. Our left needle is still removed from the machine, so there's no thread running through this one. Our right needle is going to remain on a setting of 3, and our looper's tension has been raised up to a 5. So both the upper and lower looper are now on a tension of 5. For a rolled hem, what you also want is a very small stitch length. Some machines will have a setting R for a rolled hem. Other machines, you just want to lower your stitch length below about 1.5, 1, so that it's a very short stitch length. What you'll also want to do for a rolled hem is to move your setting to an R. There's a little slider just here on the machine, and it removes the stitch finger, which is the little piece of metal that's moving just underneath my finger there. This stitch finger keeps the threads out towards the edge of the fabric, and when it's removed, it will let the threads roll the edge of the fabric inwards. So it needs to be slid away from the N or S position. Some machines are labelled up S, some machines are labelled up N, to the R position by sliding it backwards to there. On some machines, you may have to move the blade out of the way to do this, so it's best to check your manual as to whether you need to move the blade out of the way. Normally, if this little slider won't move easily, that's a clue to know that you have to move your blade out of the way first. So here are 2 rolled hems I've run through the machine. The top one here is through a woven fabric. The one below has actually been used on a chiffon fabric, a much sheerer fabric. That short stitch length makes sure that these edges are wrapped up beautifully, and it gives you a really fine finish that isn't going to fray. It's just through a single layer of fabric, and this can be used to edge the bottom of fine fabrics for skirts and dresses and floaty summer tops. When you want to go back to 4 threads, you just pop the needle back in the same way it came out and tighten up that little screw once more. The left needle should sit slightly higher than the right. The last thing to mention is something called the differential feed. On some machines you will find it down on the left hand side, like this one. On most machines you will actually find it over on the right hand side by the hand wheel. You'll have the stitch length selector that runs up to 4, and then you've got the differential feed that is normally set on a 1, and it runs from 0.7 up to 2. The way you use the differential feed is by having a good look at the fabric running through the machine. Normally, when it's set on a 1, your fabric will appear nice and flat. It won't look stretched, it won't look gathered. If it does look gathered at all, you may want to reduce the number on your differential feed down towards 0.7. That will have the result of stretching out the fabric ever so slightly as it runs under the feed dogs, and it will mean that your fabric no longer looks gathered. If you see your fabric being stretched by the machine, so if you see it being pulled into ripples instead of laying nice and flat, you can bring the differential feed up to towards the 2. So you can take it up by degrees, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4, 2, to see when your fabric starts to lay a lot flatter and doesn't look like it's being stretched by the machine. So that's the differential feed, and that's a little extra tool you can use to help get your stitches laying nice and flat and your fabric coming out just as you want to see it. So that brings us to the end of this little tutorial. The key thing to remember is to run samples each time you've got a new kind of fabric, a new project on the go. Make sure you run those samples so that you can make the little tweaks and changes that might be required to get those stitches looking perfect. Thicker fabrics might need a slightly lower tension, thinner fabrics may need a slightly higher tension, and we've also got little things like the differential feed and the stitch length that you can make little tweaks and changes to get the perfect stitch for your particular project. The main thing is to persevere, and very soon your overlocker will become as much of a sewing companion as your sewing machine. Goodbye for now. I'll see you next time.